All right. Now, in the presentations today, the next slide, if you jump ahead there, what I've done is I've just compared the sample in terms of inclusion, the medium for interaction, thinking about deliberative quality, and then finally the impact. So let me just go through these briefly and highlight a couple things. In the Euro Citizens consultation, I thought it was a very important point that the sample was disproportionately high in its educational level. That's something I've seen before in different deliberative processes, and I think it's a significant concern. It's the reason why some processes pay very well. That is, the participants get paid a fair bit of money just to show up. That tends to ameliorate that problem and bring in people of lower socioeconomic status. In the long term, I would recommend that some of these deliberative processes get built into law in a way such that when you are invited, you are protected from your employer complaining if you actually choose to show up. That is, the jury system in the United States, for instance, when you're called to jury service, it's understood that if you choose to report, nothing can be done to you by your employer. With these kinds of informal experiments and so on, I think sometimes people feel pressure to stay at work. They're afraid there will be repercussions if they go. So we need to legally protect that, and not just pay people to really solve that problem. And then as far as impact from the consultation, the research there was emphasizing that there was a subjective impact. People really felt like, they'd done something, but in the end, no policy impact. Turning to the Citizens Agora, here I would underscore what the authors said, which is when you draw from civil society, you tend to get this kind of elite group, and I think it winds up creating a body that has trouble sometimes getting legitimacy. Participatory budgeting has worked on this model to some effectiveness, but that is kind of the exception. The other thing that was emphasized, as I said before, was limited interaction. It's important to think about these different processes in relation to the particular task put before the body. So some deliberative processes will do just fine meeting for only a day or two, but some really need a week or a series of weekends. And that, I think, can't be emphasized enough, that you have to have enough interaction to match the particular charge or question you're giving the deliberative body. Now, the Ideal EU study, here it was interesting that they thought the online deliberation was better because you were getting more elaborated, more substantive arguments. If you think about it, that kind of makes sense just in terms of writing an argument versus making one up on the fly. And I liked their idea, which they said didn't really quite work out, of combining online and face-to-face deliberation. The Australian Citizens Parliament, we're going to see in a few minutes, did that maybe a little more effectively, giving the online folks a very specific task that then was funneled right into the face-to-face deliberation. But I think, kind of getting the pros and cons of both processes is a good idea in general. The other thing I wanted to note from that presentation that I appreciated was the idea that if you don't have a policy impact, even if people had a great experience of deliberation, they may wind up feeling very frustrated in the end, and it may become kind of self-destructive. So that's something to watch out for, of course. The Europolis is a proposed study using the index you heard about. So we don't know about the quality of the deliberation there. We know that the Europolis had some attitude impact. I really encourage us to think carefully about how much attitude impact is kind of enough. Do we really need people to be changing their minds? To what degree would make it, as an earlier paper said, efficient, that is worth the cost of all this? The other thing I would say is, I just want to underscore that some deliberative processes stay with a model of individuals making decisions as opposed to a collective body making judgments. And the Europolis is an example of where the individual change is probably going to be relatively restricted and narrow because you're asking sort of private individuals their before and after opinions. You tend to get, I think, bigger impacts on average when there's more of a group process, and there's, frankly, social influence. Finally, the Citizens Forum Europe, again, we're just kind of starting to look at that in the presentation there. But here I want to underscore what was implicit and is through all these presentations is no policy impact. And when I was initially invited to talk today, that was one of the things I was asked to address is, what are some ways deliberation can have a policy impact? So if you look at the next slide here, the 8 processes, some of these have really stark impacts. First, the civil and criminal jury is something I've been studying a lot. If you're interested in the research we're doing The Jury End Democracy project is online. You can read papers we're doing. But the basic point is quite straightforward. These juries have been given the authority to resolve legal questions. That's it. That's what they do. They make decisions all the time. Do they have a policy impact? They are policy. They are final, except to the extent that there's an appeal, which is relatively uncommon. So juries are a great example of citizens deliberating and actually making decisions. End of story. Participatory budgeting, I alluded to earlier, helps set city budgets. I'd also encourage people interested in that to look at the People's Campaign in India, which sets whole state planning budgets through a complicated process, but it's not random selection. It's just kind of whoever shows up. But it's gotten a lot of attention in that particular state in India. Has quite a track record of deliberation and participation. The deliberative poll, the folks doing that sometimes point to their example in China of an example of a poll that actually set priorities for policy. Of course, ironic being in a relatively repressive regime that the deliberative poll would have that impact, but it's an interesting example. A relatively obscure one you might not have heard of is the biobank deliberations held in British Columbia. And the only reason I include it here is one of their goals was not just to reach consensus recommendations, but also to identify key points of disagreement and kind of flesh those out. That's something, again, we don't always think about. And I really want to discourage being too singularly focused on achieving consensus. Maybe sometimes we trace ourselves a little too literally, I think, back to Habermas on that point. Citizens' Parliament in Canberra, Australia, I referred to. There, the online parliament first kind of came up with a set of potential reforms, and then the face-to-face parliament kind of prioritized those. They had the chance to add and extend and revise and remove. But the online folks really had quite an impact. They put on the agenda almost every policy recommendation that ultimately was passed forward. They didn't have the job of prioritizing, which is interesting. The online part really divided into separate proposals, and then each group worked on their own proposals. So there wasn't as much interactive deliberation across different points of view online. That was done face-to-face, but it's a great example if you're interested in how to use online and face-to-face. Policy impact, not as clear. Time will tell. We'll see. Citizens' Assembly in British Columbia had the potential to have a very clear and straightforward and powerful impact in that the Citizens' Assembly, which you may have heard of, also it's been held in Ontario and a few other places have tried similar things. Here the randomly selected citizens body actually drafted a new electoral system that was then put to a vote of the full province. 57% of the people in British Columbia ultimately supported it, but 60% was required for passage. They voted again and it just got crushed. So it's not actually an example of passing a law, but it certainly is an example of consequential deliberation because that body was empowered to put a question on the ballot for ratification. Had it passed, that would have been the end of that. So it's an example of, I think, really one of the most empowered deliberative processes to date. Then finally, the Citizens Initiative Review is something I'm involved in and very excited about. It's happening in the Pacific Northwest. I'd have to take off the hat for that region. They are later this year going to be doing kind of like a citizens jury process. The amazing thing there is that the citizens jury is going to be analyzing a question that's already being put on the Oregon ballot. They'll analyze it and implicitly kind of make recommendations to the voters of Oregon. Their recommendations and their kind of factual analysis of this initiative going on the ballot will be put in something called a voter's guide. This is a pamphlet that's mailed to every single household in the state. So again, it's a very empowered process. The citizens aren't deciding whether to pass this initiative, and they're not deciding what the content of the initiative is, but they are sending out a very detailed analysis and set of recommendations to the entire electorate. Is that going to be electorally relevant? Well, we're actually going to be studying that to find out, but I think there's a pretty good bet it will be.